This is Conversation Balloons, a podcast of interviews with experts and friends about all things generational. I'm your host, Leah Farish. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you're listening to this show. We're so happy to welcome Felice Gerwitz to our episode today. We're going to be talking about homeschooling, and I really appreciate you coming on, Felice.
Oh, my pleasure. It's so nice to be in front of your audience and share something that is my passion after all. So wonderful.
Felice is president of Media Angels. She's an author, speaker, and podcaster. And we're going to do a podcast swap. So listen for me on her show, Vintage Homeschool Moms, in a while.
Yes.
She's the founder of the Ultimate Homeschool Podcast Network and the Ultimate Christian Podcast Network. Because you have homeschooled and now you have this really media empire that relates to homeschooling and parenting, you have seen so much, not just your own experience, but you really have your finger on the pulse of the whole homeschool world. How are you seeing that homeschooling is changing since when you were doing it?
When I started homeschooling, Leah, we could not get homeschool curriculum, if you can believe that. It was not available. And I'm not sure when you started homeschooling and if that's a similar story, but we had to make ourselves a company and say, our school was hawk run because we lived on several acres and we had hawks in our yard. So I was talking to the children saying, well, what should we name our school? And we had to have letterhead stationery and send it in to actually get textbooks. Fast forward, we have digital books now. I've created a lot of books with Media Angels, which is really where I started. I started speaking at conferences and writing books, never thinking that I wanted to be an author, but more of like a best-selling fiction author, not a how to teach science author, because I didn't like science as a child. As a teacher, I taught for several years in the system and as a homeschool mom, but my kids loved it. So that's where God took me. And God does have a sense of humor. And it is always amazing to me that was the first book I published. Still in print. It's in its 5th edition, soon to be 6th, because we keep updating it. But, it has so changed. And I really think in some ways for the better, in other ways, I'm not so sure. And it forced us to be creative, I believe. I think it because you couldn't just get any book you wanted. And you couldn't hop on the internet because there was no hopping on the internet at the very beginning. So you actually went to the library and you looked around and said, oh my gosh, how am I going to teach these subjects? And forcing us to be creative.
So mostly it's the access to technology that has changed?
That and the ability to buy almost anything you want at this point. The textbooks, if I wanted to get a secular textbook, all I have to do is, put in to buy it. Not that many of us homeschoolers want to emulate the public schools, but I came from that my education was in elementary ed, learning disabilities, and early childhood training. So I had, a double major, so to speak, more certification. And I was of the idea that we're going to recreate the home or the school at home, which my first, I just told you, was a struggling learner. That didn't work too well. So I had to look at him and say, okay, what is he excited about? And I think as parents, if you can just sit back, and I know we don't have time, but do this. Just do this one thing. Sit back and observe your kids. Watch them when they play. Watch what they're interested in. I have 2, pet peeves in my homeschooling podcast. I talk about that on Vintage Homeschool Moms. And one is we don't give our kids time to think, and we don't give our kids enough time to explore. And if you do those 2 things, because some people will say, well, my child's bored and all they want to do is play video games. Well, I was one of those moms that I'm going to two confessions here. I don't know if I've ever really admitted this on a podcast before, Leah, but I loved the video games. To me, when they first came out, they were the most amazing things. Like the computer talked to you, it'd say, "Hi, Felice, welcome." Now we're so used to that, right? And I'm like, oh my gosh, it's talking to me. It knows my name. Well, of course, I entered my name in when I was playing this game with my child, but I didn't let my children have a lot of games and devices because it forced them to go outside. And so they built forts. They didn't have a lot of friends on our block because we lived on acreage and there weren't a lot of kids who lived in our area. So we actually had to drive to the park and meet people. So when you go to the park or you have kids over and you live on a couple of acres in Florida with a pond, and Dad built a tree house for them. And then when they got older, they had a slide across, which Mom did not condone, but they loved, and they
Makes it
built.
more important
Oh
what
my
if she
gosh.
doesn't condone it,
Yeah.
right?
Yes. I mean, I think I have video I found on an ancient hard drive of the kids building catapults. And they said they were going to go build catapults, but, Dad's in construction and has huge, I don't even know what these things, they were like 16 feet, I think, this one piece of wood. And they built this thing that was probably very dangerous. I know it was very dangerous. They were young. My oldest of the three younger ones was in high school or older middle school at the time. He works with my husband. He's our vice president of our
Oh,
construction company now.
no wonder.
But when you talk about catapults and you're showing them this little graph and you're doing these little experiments and they're like, "What's this?" and then go out and do things like that. To me, it was so wonderful that they took a little bit of learning and went outdoors and continued on. Not to mention the time we, gave them I gave them a box. I talk about it in my teaching science and having fun that just had science stuff in it because my measuring cups would disappear. And I'm like, do not take my good measuring cups. So I gave them a box with benign things you would think, like a little microscope they could take outside and little containers and the magnifying glasses. That was not very wise because we had talked about what you can do with the sun. And in Southwest Florida, the sun's very hot. So I had my youngest came running in and he's yelling, going, "Mom, Nick's starting a fire." He always wanted to tell his older brother. And Nick was indeed starting a fire with the thoughts of, well, if I get this going big enough, we can have hot dogs out here, and grill on the cement. I don't know. But they did all kinds of things. And as they've gotten older, when everybody gets back together, they share stories of things they did that, Leah, I did not know. And I think God saves you from these things because, I did not need to know that Mike was jumping off. This is the youngest, the back watershed and learning how to roll in case he was ever a paratrooper, which he's not. They all played sports. And that was another thing that homeschooling allowed them to do and two played in college. So it allowed us to do things I never would have imagined. I had the daughter, and she and I actually wrote a series of novels for teens or tweens called the Truth Seekers Mystery Series. That was her love, was writing.
I think another thing that has changed is the internet hasn't just put us in touch with great resources, but put us in touch with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one thing that you're doing a great job with is connecting homeschoolers and being a clearinghouse for those connections and resources and not just generating resources for them, but letting them find each other. And that was hard for me when I was starting out. I knew a couple of homeschoolers from church, and
Mm-hmm.
I was, constantly plying them for information. And finally, there was one book by Mary Pride about homeschooling that, became my Bible of homeschooling. And there
Yeah.
just wasn't much out there. And then, we started having conventions and,
Right.
finding each other. But the community, I thought was really a new development and something I didn't have. But it sounds like one of the things you treasure about your early experience in it was the initiative and the uniqueness and that finding your own way and doing it just, you know,
Right. I did have
gut,
friends.
studying
I
your
Yeah,
studying your children. You said, really know your kids,
right.
and so, but you say you did have some friends that were also doing
I
it.
did. I did. I had a group of friends. I prayed about it and said, Lord, if you want me to homeschool, I need to find some resources. And I asked around and I met this lady, and my son's diagnosis was mosaicism, which is a form of Down syndrome. So it's only in a percentage of his cells, but the cells do not replicate. So by the time we had him tested at 4 years old, they couldn't really tell me the severity of the issue. And basically, it manifested itself in, some comprehension and delay in, auditory, just in talking. He actually spelled really well, but sometimes he didn't know what the words meant. So it was interesting. He's an interesting person. He's a Lyft driver now, and he does really well with the tips because I prayed he would speak clearly, and he is a talker. So be careful what you pray for. Anyway, I did have a small group of people, and the lady that God introduced me to, just in asking around, her husband was a physician and her daughter was also Downs. So she was the perfect resource. And she said, what have you been doing? And I said, I just treat him normally. And she said, perfect. That's what you need to do. And because I think we had very high expectations, his IQ is normal, so we were really blessed, that he did well with homeschooling, which was also another reason I continued on. Secondly, I prayed extensively for more friends, and I ended up with some amazing dear friends that I still have to this day. And, some of them put their kids back in school in high school, and that was always a temptation. But I never, I talk to my children. Some children want to go back into traditional schooling. And I always asked why, if a friend's child said something, and if they're like, oh, to have friends. Well, my children had more friends than they needed playing sports. Several played on travel teams, and there just was, for them, that was, I think, really important to do that as well as homeschool. So it gave them a lot more flexibility. Secondly, I think that as parents, we have to put our needs first. And I know that sounds very narcissistic, and people are going to be like, oh, what do you mean? It means that if you feel that you know best, you know your child best, and if you feel that they would benefit from homeschooling, then that's what you need to do, and focus on that. And then talk to them. Some kids are not happy homeschoolers. Some kids are great at home, And I think so much of our society today is to do what the child wants and when the child wants it, rather than what is best for them as a parent. Thinking about homeschooling and starting with confidence, because when I would go to conference, I would be so amazed at these young mommies and daddies. They don't even have kids, Leah. They did not have children yet. They were married, and they were just looking into homeschooling. And I thought, oh my gosh, you are so blessed to be looking into it now. I jumped in. I had my small core group of 8 moms, and we started a homeschool group here in Fort Myers, and it was wonderful, and I was blessed by them. And then the group grew into a larger Christian homeschooling group. And we, at one point we had hundreds of kids. You talk about Mary Pride. It was amazing to meet her in person, and we just sat and talked like we had known each other forever. And she's like one of those, I think gifts from God, that God gave us people like Mary Pride, like Kathy Duffy. If you want to look up, what is this? What do people say about this book? You can ask a friend, but you can also go to kathyduffyreviews.com, and I got to know Kathy through the years. So I've had her on my podcast many times. She was one of the people that I could not convince to have a podcast on the network. She did not want a podcast, but she said, "I'll come on your show whenever you want." So
Oh,
that's always fun. Um, and so I decided, you know what? Traveling is difficult, especially with the younger three. And I am going to, pray and say, Lord, what do you want me to do? How am I going to get the Media Angels books out there and let people know about them? And that's where the idea for the podcast network came up.
I also think that homeschoolers now, they're homeschooling for reasons that just so many diverse reasons. I think we had a lot of religious homeschoolers at the outset, but now I think there are a lot of secular families that are just recognizing, the need for something besides the public school down the street. They're not getting even basic civility and basic respect taught and modeled at school, and they're not pleased with the academic outcomes of their school that's offered. The
Mm-hmm.
taxpayer
No, I
funded
think you're
schools
right.
are just they don't have much to show for their efforts. And
Mm-hmm.
I also have noticed that there's just so much greater public acceptance of homeschooling, and especially after COVID, I think workplaces and colleges are just not interested in having a traditional origin for these kids' education. They're open to all kinds of backstories to their
No, I
students
agree.
and employees
Mm-hmm.
because they're just not getting the quality of people coming in that they need. And I think that homeschoolers have just earned that public acceptance. It was
Mm-hmm.
not given to them automatically. And I think if early homeschoolers hadn't had a good track record, we wouldn't be where we are today. And
No, absolutely. Yeah. And people call me a pioneer. And I said, no, I wasn't one of the ones that paved the way like some of the people that I've met that really did. I mean, we didn't go out a lot with the older two at the beginning because if we went to the grocery store, everyone wanted to know why the kids weren't in school. And
mhm,
you got tired of them asking that. So we just went after, early afternoon, and they still asked. Um, is that legal? And then, it just was very irritating. So many of us didn't venture from home, and now nobody bats an eye. You're right. It has become more mainstream. A lot of the, ideas of the past, for example, doing unit studies, some people will look at it and say, oh my gosh, this is too much work. I want to do a virtual school or I want to do a self-paced class, which we have some of those too on our website, and we're creating more of them because that's where people are going. To think that you want to do a unit study, is really committing as a parent and spending the time and doing it. I think it's worth it because you are going to create thinkers. There's a lot of curriculum, how to teach your kids to think. Well, do a unit study and you will be teaching the children to think. I taught a religious class at Sunday school one year, and I remember the kids saying, well, what's the right answer? And I just thought to myself, well, what do you think? And they were just like, nobody asks me what I think. And my children were in the back seat when dad and I were discussing what kind of car we wanted, and they're chiming in, and we were looking at each other saying, why do they have an opinion? I don't know if that ever happened to you, Leah, with your
yeah,
children,
yeah,
but it was just like they had an opinion about everything because that's what we nurtured in our home.
mhm.
And it took me a minute to say, all right, you guys, and they would say, Mom can make anything into school. I would say, okay, write me a short paragraph. I didn't say a whole paper because I'd have to read it. And I said, write me a short paragraph on what car you think we should get next. And then they wrote their ideas, and handed
Oh,
them in. But it was,
It's interdisciplinary study,
right. I
as they
think
say
so.
in the
I
education
I
world.
love that. I love that. Yeah, I'm gonna borrow that. Oh gosh. But it's to me it was such a blessing, and I don't know of any homeschool parent that I know or have been in contact with. And maybe if you have a listener who, is a disgruntled homeschool past parent, I don't know, write me. But most parents are very happy they homeschool their children.
Mhm.
Most parents wanted to continue homeschooling, and they had, a child who just said, no, I want to, experience what's out there. And some of them did it fine, and others regretted it. Children lost their faith and so forth. And that's why, if you are a person of faith, I would really encourage you to challenge your children about what they believe, have real discussions. We had a lot of discussions in our home, and we still do. And we don't always agree on things, but it is very vibrant, and it has to be respectful. There's no name calling, there's no character assassination. There was just, we just want facts. The answer to the question is not you're stupid. That means
Right.
the translation for that is mom, give me work. So I always translated. And they're like, that's not what it meant. And I said, well, that's what it means in this home. And you only need to do it a few times,
Yeah.
and kids are smart and they catch on. So,
Well,
they,
one thing I noticed about homeschoolers right before I started was homeschoolers would look me in the eye, and um, I've heard that said about other people. They notice that homeschoolers make great eye contact, and
mhm,
they had this demeanor that was more like, um, "You're a colleague."
right.
It was when I say equal, I don't mean,
I know what you mean. Yes. Right.
disrespectful. It was
Right.
like,
Right.
I'm open to your ideas, and I'm assuming that you're open to mine. And
Exactly.
it's about the substance of what you're saying. It's not about whether I'm above you in rank or below you in rank. Yes, we have parental authority, but kids in a homeschool setting are more free to interact with each other and with the teacher because it's their mom. And you
Right.
don't have those barriers. You don't have the 2 weeks initially in the classroom where you're trying to earn their respect and da 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 da, and
Right.
go through all these protocols and deal with a range of kids who have a huge range of what they think is acceptable behavior.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's so on track, Leah. I think that is so true. And something we sometimes forget as homeschool parents, if a parent says, well, my child doesn't respect me, and we'll talk, and then you find out that, do as I say, not as I do, and things like that. And I would always say, well, why are they picking up my bad habits? And then I was praying about this, and the Lord's so good, and I really felt the Lord saying, well, those are the ones you're demonstrating the most,
Mhm,
my bad habits.
mhm,
So then you're like, okay, I need to really go to the Lord with that and really see how I can change it, because there's so much to do in the home. One of the moms was saying to me, the laundry never ends. And I said, well, the laundry never ends whether they're in school, traditional school, or not. You're still
mhm,
going to have laundry. But when the kids are home, everybody helps. And I was a
mhm,
big proponent, because I'm not a perfectionist. So for you perfectionist moms out there, I'm sorry. You have to, my mother-in-law was a perfectionist, and she taught my two older children how to fold clothes because their mom did not teach them how to fold clothes perfectly. And I was fine with that. More power to you. Come fold my clothes. They're, to this day, my two older children fold clothes like grandma did. And the three younger, poor things, grandma was too old to come over and do that. But it was still, something that we treasure that they know how to fold clothes perfectly. But they helped. So my daughter is amazing because not only that, but she has her children do their own laundry. I oversaw them doing their laundry. But then again, when you have that many, they each have a laundry day and they're very self-sufficient. And I think that's wonderful. For those of us that went to college and had to teach people how to do laundry or how to make a sandwich or other things, and I just looked at them and said, how did you not know how to make a sandwich? Well, my mom did it for me. You're 18 years old. So I can say that about homeschool kids, especially in our world here. They know how to do things, and I think it makes them self-sufficient, and it gives them a sense of pride, a good sense of pride that, look, I accomplished and I can do something. And I think that's important too.
Well, I want to spend the last 10 minutes or so talking about how to keep going. Once you've decided you want to do this and you've done it for a couple of years and you're maybe questioning whether to continue or feeling burned out, what's some advice that you have for keeping going?
I think, again, ask your children, what are some things that they want to learn? I know that for me, I had one son who sat me down when he was 14, the one who is our vice president of our company now. And he said, Mom, I want to learn about business and how can I take over Dad's company? And I'm just like, okay, you're 14. Let's start at the beginning. Just, now he's so funny because I don't think he wants to take it over. He has a couple of businesses on his own now. But, those are the kinds of things you do. So we went and got business classes, and a lot of it's corporate, how to work with a group of people and how to, that kind of thing. But it was really, really good. And my other daughter was very interested in history. Christina wanted to write. And so I think if homeschooling allows your children to pursue their interests, again, this can be nurtured when they're younger, and then you don't have that issue when they're older of wanting to go back to school. Another aspect of homeschooling, I know one family I met, their requirement for homeschool graduation was to create a business and have it be sustainable. I know, it was amazing. And this one young lady did a phenomenal job because she wanted to help, let's say, Africa. I don't remember where these people were, but she made jewelry and things like that. I don't remember the name of the company to this second, but it actually turned out to be a phenomenal company. And that was what her idea was, is help these women in these, very oppressed places who, had to help support their families, create something beautiful that they could then translate and sell in the US. So you have to weigh it. And I've never said, oh my gosh, that person's horrible because they decided to go back to traditional school. It's not my business. It's not my life. It's your life and it's your children's lives. But I will say that, again, I don't know of anyone that homeschooled through high school and had a lot of regrets, but I do know people who did not and had a lot of regrets. And I think the biggest thing that I will say about homeschooling that worked for us was the closeness of our family. Our family has remained really close as people you want to be around.
Yes.
And I think, for me, I love when my kids are here. We try to do Sunday dinners. My one daughter who is married lives in Bradenton, and she teaches at a Christian school. She's head coach. She actually, can I throw this out there? She got Teacher of the Year and Coach of the Year.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah. She was my history buff child. And, but she says when she has children, she wants to stay home and homeschool them.
Well,
so yeah.
Yeah, I think that there are ways to tell if you're burned out, and whether you decide to quit homeschooling as a result of that recognition, or you just find ways to refresh it and reignite yourself and your kids. That's a different question. But I think some homeschoolers don't know when they're getting burned out, and I noticed a couple of things to watch for. If I was losing my sense of humor,
Mm-hmm.
I was
That's good.
probably burned out. And if, uh, well, I never experienced this, but if you feel like you don't like your children, I think that is a serious problem because they will pick up on it.
Mm-hmm.
And um, I think there are times we always love our children, but
Mm-hmm.
sometimes we don't like them. And it's very hard to teach someone that you don't like or that and they'll pick up on it and they won't learn. When I was a classroom teacher in a very fine private school in Dallas, we teachers were asked to talk about the worst teacher we ever had.
Mm-hmm.
And it was invariably someone that they didn't like. It was not that the teacher was a bad teacher. It was usually unfairness that was the issue, but something that broke that relationship between the teacher and the student. And I think that can happen in a home as well. It's not, excuse me, it's not irreparable, but it can happen and it needs attention. Even whether you're teaching them as their homeschool teacher or they're in traditional
Right.
school, you
Right.
need to deal with that. And I think for larger families, there can be a burnout in needing to present the same material to the third and the fourth child. I was teaching at a university here in the Tulsa area, and the president of the university said to the faculty one time, freshmen are 18 every year. and, and we tend
Right.
to think as parents, oh, I've covered this, I've done this. I can't believe I have to do, long division facts or something with
Right.
another child. But again, they've never been 8 years old before.
Right.
They've never been fifth graders before or whatever. This is new to them, and you have to be new for them.
Right. And I think a couple of things I want to address. One, when you're talking about burnout and you said, I don't like my child very much. Sometimes I would have to pray, Lord, you love this child more than I do. And you gave me this child for a reason,
Mhm.
for purification, more than likely, And so, um, please help me love this child as you love them. And I have prayed that before. And not that I ever got to where I didn't like my kid. I just didn't like, I would say, I love you, but I don't like how you're acting.
Yeah.
And so just, really hone in. Secondly, I did go through that when I have a gap between the first two and the last three. Same husband, I always say, but we had a gap in there, and Christina was 12, Neil was 14 when I had Nicholas. So that's a huge gap. And
Yeah.
then, I finally got rid of the Fisher Price toys, and then I had to bring those back again. I felt like I was in, the movies where you wake up and everything is the same.
Groundhog Day.
Yeah. So I really, prayed to the Lord and said, what can I do differently? And my husband and I always say we learned not to make the same mistakes. And so we felt like we parented the last three so much better than we did the first two.
Oh,
For one thing, we were more relaxed, been there, done that, seen this, can't pull that one over on me. The next thing, Leah, is I did change things up because there was no way I could use that same curriculum and survive. In fact, I was telling Christina, before you leave home, you have to teach Nick to read. I can't
oh,
do this again. And then number five child, the youngest, actually taught himself to read around 4 because he kept asking me if he could read. And I didn't have time to just sit there and work with him on reading because I had other things going on. And I just said, look, I've got these fun things for you to do while mommy's schooling the other two. So one day he came up to me and he said, oh, Mom, you don't need to teach me to read. I taught myself to read. And I said, you did what? And I sat down and he taught himself to read. So I said, thank you, Lord.
Amazing.
I know that was a
Oh,
gift. That was a gift. And so, so yes, there are things that you can look at and do. And my big thing, and I think this is one thing my daughter and I were talking about. She said a lot of people have lost the vision of why we homeschool and the mission of why we homeschool. And we homeschool even if you have no belief in God. You homeschool because you love your child and you want the best for them.
mhm.
As Christian parents, we love our children and we want salvation for them. We want them to, be wise and, loving and holy and all of the things, the character qualities that I wrote, however many studies on those that we were giving away free at one point, just because I felt that character was so important and we could do so many different things as a homeschool family, a lot of care, acting out of things. And, if you wanted to write it down, you could. But I really felt that children needed to know what some of these things, what is patience? What does that mean? What is kindness? Things that we take for granted, and we just expect our children to know what we mean when we say be kind. They understand don't hit your sibling, but why don't we? My grandchildren come, and in fact, they're all coming over. I take them in groups, so I'm taking from the 12-year-old down to the 6-year-old, and there's 4 of them, 3 boys and a girl. And so when they come to grandma's house, I set out the rules and they're perfect. And sometimes they're not so perfect when mom comes to pick them up. There's complaining and there's talking. So the grandma has some rules. There's no complaining because that means, Grandma, I need to go pull weeds. You wouldn't make us do that. I said, absolutely, I would. Grandma's got a lot of gardens in the front. And so, they typically don't test me, but they're excellent when they come. And why is that, Leah? Because they know what is expected, and we have a blast at grandma's. We do. This is my outlet for crafts and all the things, painting and the things I don't have time for. When the kids are with me, we make the time. So I think that burnout is real. I think that some parents really struggle with it. And I think that's the time to just, kick back and maybe don't do school that day. And maybe say to the kids, let's do something different. We're going to take a break, especially when my children fought. Um, that would be, I would say, put your books away. We're going to talk and figure out and get to the bottom of this. And they're like, well, we're not going to get behind and whatever. And I said, well, it's okay. We have Saturdays and Dad's home. They did not like doing school with Dad because, as one of my kids said, Dad made me write my math perfectly. He did. He said, erase this. I can't read this. And this is really messy. And they're just like, Mom never makes us do that. So, Mom was much preferable to Dad. And I think too that a good support system is wonderful. I'm sure you have a community that surrounds your podcast. We have a wonderful community on Facebook that so many people don't use, but every single one of my podcasters is in that Facebook group, and it's a private group. And if you have any questions, you can tag any of us and ask. And that's a community of people who are there willing to help. And why is that? Because we've all struggled.
Mhm.
We've all gone through things. I mean, I had, ill parents and, in-laws that were ill, and my elderly father lived with us for 10 years.
Wow.
And so, life happens and there's tragedies in families and so many things. And that's a season to take a break. The schooling is going to be there. And I don't know if you found this, Leah, but the kids, especially even with some of mine that struggled, you get so much more done at home than you ever can in traditional schooling. There's no changing of classes. There's no, wasted time or delay. And
Mhm.
even in high school, when my kids pretty much were working on their own, there were still some subjects we did together, and they had some video class. Back then we used, the DVDs. We came up from VHSs, and so we go to conference, and the kids were like, "He's in my video." I said, "I know." And so I think that there can be a time and a season for different things. And the other thing I want to say, and this is so true across the board, do not compare yourself to anyone else. If you do that, you're going to say, "Oh my gosh, I'm failing," but you only see the good part of someone else's life. You don't see what's really going on. And so, pray about it, seek the Lord, seek the counsel of good friends. I think too, we have to look at it and say, why am I doing this? What is my mission? What is my call? And if you have figured that out, that is really going to be helpful. And, whatever that is, it needs to work for your family.
Well, thank you for those thoughts. And I read, I don't know if it's a blog or what, that I read that you said that you had kind of a constant prayer throughout your child rearing years, "Come, Holy Spirit." I think that a constant orientation to God, it keeps that channel open. And
Absolutely.
He can renew us when we can't renew ourselves. And my mantra all through homeschooling and parenting was, "Jesus, reduce me to love."
Oh, beautiful. That's
He
beautiful, Leah.
faithfully kept me on track with, just that focus. Well,
Beautiful.
Felice, you are a fountain of knowledge and wisdom, and I really so appreciate your time. I know your time is very valuable. You've got so much going on.
Thank you.
But I'll be glad to talk to you on your podcast, Vintage
Absolutely.
Homeschoolers, and we will keep in touch. Maybe, who knows how we might collaborate. But thank you for
Wonderful.
coming.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Subscribe and review Conversation Balloons on your favorite podcast platform. Find me at leahfarish.com and on Instagram at LeahFarish.